folks, this is Available Moxie, aka Sakers the Billy Goat here, and today I just want to do a video about the new Perk Deck Rebalance. Typically I give my thoughts on Reddit via text, but I thought I would try something new and do it via a video for you guys. I'm going to try to keep it as brief as possible, but there is a lot to go over, so I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into it. I'm not going to review the decks one by one. Instead, I'm going to kind of break them down into groups to see what they compete against and the ways that that they work and they're balanced. The first one that I'm going to do is the biggest group, which is Armor, Sociopath, Infiltrator, and Muscle. These are all your primary combat armor decks. They're for, you want to go in, you want to tank, you want to kill. Just your basic non-support killing stuff decks. Armor got a little bit better with some additional bonuses to how much armor it provides, but the main problem with armor is that while it got a little bit better, everything else got a lot better. And I don't think that the increase in armor has kept pace with the advantages that other perk decks have gotten. Namely, of those four that I mentioned, Armor, Sociopath, Infiltrator, and Muscle, Armor is now the only one that doesn't have a way to regenerate its health somehow. And that's a pretty big deal, because we're going to see the meta shift away from the use of Berserker. The old meta where you sat with 300 armor at 10% health on Death Wish and just shot at everything with Berserker maxed out, that's gone. That is dead. It was already on life support before, but this perk deck rebalance has killed that. That meta is gone. Berserker is not very good anymore because you have to give up just way too much effective hit points for it to be any good. So because Armor can't leverage its health pool without outside help, namely from Gambler, it makes it kind of an inferior choice. Especially because of the Infiltrator deck. The Infiltrator deck now, you actually have more effective armor while the damage reduction is in effect. And on Death Wish, there are very few situations where you're going to somehow be in a situation where you're taking a lot of fire and you need your health regenerate and you need that damage reduction active, but you somehow don't have two people within 18 meters of you. Like, that's never going to happen. So Infiltrator's damage reduction, it might as well just be on all the time. It's probably never going to fall off in any situation that matters. And when you calculate out the effective armor value of Infiltrator with its damage reduction versus the effective armor value of Armor with its bonus, Infiltrator actually has more armor. So Infiltrator is more durable, and Infiltrator can get back 20% of its health, which is a huge chunk of health when it melees people. So why would you ever go Armor anymore? I don't know. Maybe if you really wanted to do that Berserker style, but if you did want to do that, then you could just run Infiltrator and not melee. So, yeah, Armor has kind of suffered the most here due to the fact that it didn't get good enough. Everything else got way, way better, and it just didn't. It got a little bit better in a world where everything else got a lot better. As far as Sociopath and Muscle go, Sociopath is probably the second weakest of the four, but it's close. It's a lot better than I thought it would be when I tested it, because essentially you get an 8% damage reduction. And then on top of that, you're probably going to regenerate about 60 armor every time you shoot at things. You duck out of cover, you shoot at things, you're going to proc that 60 armor regeneration at some point when you're fighting. So essentially it's 8% damage reduction and 60 extra armor, which is pretty good. The downside to it is that armor regeneration is kind of flaky. Sometimes you'll get hit for a little bit, shoot it and proc it and not get the full 60. Or, you might be shooting at something and then they burst you down really fast, and you can't just say you get 60 extra armor because it's not as reliable. Also, of the three, Sociopath I think has the weakest method of regenerating health on Death Wish. On Overkill, it's pretty easy to run around stabbing things. On Death Wish, that's a little bit more tricky, and because it's 10% health per stab, but a 2-second cooldown between stabbings, you can't just repeatedly stab one person to get all your health back because there's a 2-second cooldown. So if you need, if you're at 50% health, it would take you 10%, 5 stabs so that's like 10 seconds. And there's not a whole lot of situations where you can just keep an enemy alive and shooting at you on Death Wish for 10 seconds in melee. That's probably only going to happen at the end or the beginning of the wave. Infiltrators is much better because it lets you just jab somebody once, get that big boost of 20%, and then move on and do other things, which is more in keeping with how your opportunity for melee arise on Death Wish. Infiltrator is much more opportunistic. It's like, oh, there's a guy I can melee to get my armor, to get my health back. Let me go do that. Whereas Sociopath, you really need to go out of your way to set up somebody that you can melee repeatedly to get health back, and that's a lot more difficult to do. So that leaves Infiltrator and Muscle, which I think are pretty much tied for the best loud armor perk decks at the moment. There's some slight differences. Infiltrator does have slightly higher EHP because of its damage reduction bonuses. Its health regeneration is faster than Muscle, but only if you can get a melee off every 10 seconds, which again is not consistent. Whereas Muscle, you can kind of sit back and play a lot more conservatively and never get in melee range, and you'll still eventually regenerate. So I think Muscle is a lot better for, like, Medforcers that don't really want to be up there being aggressive, whereas Infiltrator might be a little bit better for a Tech Forcer who wants to play more aggressively and mix it up and will probably be in a situation to melee people. But that's really the main difference, is the way in which they get back health. Another thing to consider with Muscle is if you're planning on taking Hostage Taker, Muscle is much better, because Hostage Taker regenerates your health based on a percentage, and since Muscle has more health, that percentage-based boost is going to restore more raw HP as Muscle than it will as Infiltrator. So that kind of feeds into the whole Medforcer methodology even more, because if you're going to be a Medforcer and you're going to take Hostage Taker, Basic, or Aced, you want to be Muscle, because you'll get a better boost out of that. But if you're not, then maybe you want to go Infiltrator. I personally think either one of them is perfectly fine. They're both extremely powerful, far, far more powerful than Rogue was before, far more powerful than Grinder was, or is. So, yeah, you can't go wrong with either one. Rogue and Crook, the dodge side of things is not looking quite as good. And I want to just touch on that briefly in general, the idea of dodge versus armor. What Overkill has kind of done here is sort of restored a balance that had been sort of out of whack since Crime Fest. The general idea of most games, and I think the idea that they had planned for but didn't really execute properly, is that when you run a type of build, a type of class in a game that can go really, really fast and has a mobility advantage, they usually tend to be glass cannons, or they tend to have to give something up for that mobility. The problem was that Rogue wasn't doing that. Rogue could be the most mobile class with the highest, the highest mobility, the ability to zip around the map, really good offense with crits, and it still had more effective hit points than Armor did. It was tankier. The Rogue was tankier than the Tech Forcer in full armor, and that was really messed up. And with this patch, they fixed that. Rogue is not useless. Rogue is not broken. Rogue isn't, like, dead, as some people are saying. It's just not as tanky as the Infiltrator or Muscle. Probably not as tanky as Sociopath either. But that's okay, because Rogue is still fast. It can still fast swap. It can still zip around the map. Fugimind, Swan Song reviving is still going to be a thing, and it's still going to be really powerful. It's just that they're not the tanks anymore, and that's okay. Overkill has done a good job balancing the risk versus reward. If you want to jump around the map, killing everything with critical hits, well, you're going to have to give up something for that, and that's okay. So they've done a good job of balancing the decks off of each other. They haven't done a very good job of balancing them versus the police, but they've done a good job of balancing the players against each other. So anyway, Rogue versus Crook. Rogue is still better. The main problem here is that Crook suffers from certain inherent disadvantages to Rogue. The first inherent disadvantage is that Lightweight Ballistic Vest, or any Ballistic Vest, costs concealment, which makes Low Blow / Sneaky Bastard Basic almost impossible to run. When you lose 4 concealment taking an LBV, that 4 concealment is huge when you're trying to run that skill Basic. You'll pretty much guaranteed to either have to use an inferior loadout or give up some of your dodge and crit when you do that. Or you can spend additional points, additional 16 points acing both skills, in which case you're losing skill points. So any way you slice it, Crook loses something inherently, because those skills, Low Blow and Sneaky Bastard, are extremely powerful skills for the dodge players, and yet they don't work as well with Crook like they do with Rogue. And that's a problem. And Crook needs something to overcome that inherent disadvantage. It also has a very slight disadvantage in terms of mobility, and there is a disadvantage in terms of not getting the fast swap. The problem is that Crook gets nothing to make up for that. The only thing that Crook gets is the effective hit points from the boost to armor and the boost to dodge. Plus, they get a little bit of a faster armor regeneration rate, which doesn't make a huge deal. So basically, both Rogue and Crook are entirely effective HP decks, and Rogue has more of it, and Rogue doesn't have the downsides that I mentioned with Low Blow and Sneaky Bastard. So because of that, Crook is still not good. What Crook really needs is some sort of unique bonus that Rogue doesn't have, that will make up for the fact that it makes Low Blow and Sneaky Bastard harder to run. And it doesn't have that now. Maybe in the future it will if they ever revisit balance. But as of right now, if you want to be dodged, you're going to stick with Rogue. That said, the gap is now a lot smaller than it was before. And if you want to mess around on overkill, running around with a dodge player with as much armor as a CTV or even a little bit more, you can do that. Again, the math works out that you'll have more effective hit points if you go Rogue, but you can do that. There are some other considerations, though. Just with the health regen, Crook is going to take less health damage than Rogue is, just because they have more armor. So it might be a situation where, well, as Crook, the health damage is lower, and my buddy with Gambler can out-heal me fast than I take damage, but with Rogue, I'm taking more health damage, so I need to use medkits more, or something like that. There could be, some edge cases like that might make Crook a little bit more attractive, and down the road, maybe it's something that we'll revisit, but as of right now, it's not. It's Rogue's better. Gambler and Crew Chief. Gambler is insanely powerful now. The ability to heal your entire team for 20 every 4 seconds. You probably won't be able to maintain a perfect 4-second rate, but that rate is about twice as high as Hostage Taker and Muscle's base regeneration. Well, not quite Muscle's, because Muscle gets a bonus, and Hostage Taker is a little harder to quantify because if you're Muscle, it's higher. But the point of the matter is that Gambler's regeneration rate is quite high enough that even considering that you won't be able to keep it at peak regeneration, it's still very, very good. And then the armor is just kind of icing on the cake. The only downside to this is that Infiltrator and Muscle are so good that if you have somebody that's using Infiltrator or Muscle, you probably don't even need somebody with Gambler feeding them health, because they can already do that to themselves. I mean, like, if you're running, like, Muscle Medforcer and you've got Hostage Taker aced and you're regenerating 7 hit points a second, you don't need a Gambler helping you out. You're already never going to die. This is kind of the problem that I'm going to go over with shortly, is that Overkill has kind of destroyed the balance of the game. The game is going to be very, very easy until they difficulty tweak it. So in a world like that, where everything is easy and nobody needs support classes, both Gambler and Crew Chief are kind of going to be hurting, because everyone's going to say, well, I don't need a Gambler to support me. I'm already an unstoppable killing machine. Of the two, though, Gambler, I think, is probably the better deal. And the other downside to it is that Gambler stacks with itself. So even if you've got 2 people that are willing to take a support perk deck, you'd probably still want 2 Gamblers over Crew Chief. Crew Chief's bonuses are just too small to make a huge impact compared to Gambler, which is now a huge difference. The damage reduction on Crew Chief is actually really, really good, but the problem is that it's situational. You may not always have a hostage, and keeping the hostage is also, some additional work. So, I mean, I can see maybe it getting run somewhere, but the main problem is that Crew Chief only got a little bit better with that extra damage reduction, whereas everybody else got so much better. So taking Crew Chief is a lot more of a sacrifice now than it was before. It's not like before, where it's like, well, I can have 289 armor with Crew Chief, or 300 with No, I think it was like 270 with crew chief versus 300 with armor. So it's like, well, I give up a little bit of armor, but my entire crew gets all these bonuses. Now it's like, well, crap, I don't want to give up 414 HP and regenerating HP to give my team some bonuses they're probably never going to notice. Like, oh no, they're going to lose whatever the stamina bonus is. Who cares? So, in that regard, I think crew chief's probably not going to see a whole lot of use. Maybe some very organized, like pre-made Deathwish groups will find a use for it. But in general, I think if you want a support deck, you're probably going to run Gambler, and I'm not even sure you're going to want a support deck. Last but probably not least is Grinder. A lot of people have thought that the changes to Grinder were buffs. It wasn't. The issue with Grinder before was that the peak regeneration rate could often outdamage the amount of damage that police could do on Overkill, and sometimes even on Deathwish, and Overkill obviously didn't like that. They wanted you to have to take cover sometimes. So what they did was they reduced the peak regeneration rate to make it harder to just out-regen the damage, but then they increased the duration of the health regeneration rate so that taking cover to regenerate is now a more attractive option. Because you couldn't really take cover for an extended period before because you would just stop regenerating, and now you can. So it's not really a buff. It's kind of a nerf in that you now need to, be intelligent, take cover, and things like that. But Grinder is still perfectly usable. You're probably not going to see Grinder being as powerful as it was before, not because it's gotten weaker, but because everything else has gotten better. I mean, like, Muscle's regeneration rate can't match Grinder's, but it doesn't have to because you have armor. So, yeah, the main advantage to Grinder had always been that you could maintain it and never use resources. Well, Sociopath, Infiltrator, and Muscle and Gambler now work that way. So it used to be that was kind of unique to Grinder, and now that's half the perk decks in the game. So in that respect, Grinder did get weaker by comparison, but it's still a perfectly valid and serviceable deck. And finally, Hitman was not touched. It's still the worst perk deck in the game. Now it's even worse because everything else got better and it stayed the same. Burglar also kind of got worse in a way. It got worse for Loud, but it's still the only deck that gives any sort of bonus that matters in stealth. So you're still going to use it in stealth, but you might want to be a little bit more careful about using it in situations where there's any chance of going Plan B, because now it's weaker by virtue of everything else being stronger. So that about wraps it up. But before I go, I just want to mention one more thing. This update has made the game a lot easier. Previous to this update, it was already kind of borderline, where if you asked me, I would say that Deathwish was way, way, way too easy. And now they've just gone and made the game even easier. And I'm kind of concerned about that. It used to be that Payday, the original Payday, was a gruelingly difficult game. Most of the time, you didn't even win. It was to see how far you could get before you lost. That was pretty much the win condition. When 2 came out, they changed it so that it had kind of the all or nothing thing, where you didn't get your rewards unless if you won, as in the first, where you got rewards for getting as far as you could. And because of that, it meant that they had to adjust the difficulty, because you couldn't play it that way. You couldn't play it with the expectation of losing but seeing how far you could get, because then you would never advance. You would never gain EXP or get items, because you only got them on a win. And they did that to create the risk-reward of, do we leave or do we stay for more loot? And that's fine, but that kind of set the tone of this game is going to be easier. And they've just made the game easier and easier and easier in the 2 years since it's come out. The only significant increases to difficulty were the addition of cloakers and the Deathwish difficulty itself being added. Maybe SWAT turrets too, but that only affects certain maps. And that just has not kept pace with how much more powerful the players have gotten. Back when we first played the game, we didn't have sniper rifles. We didn't even have grenades at launch. Now we've got, the shurikens that do, 300 damage on a hit when you consider the poison. We've got, Molotov cocktails that kill anything that enters it and stun bulldozers. We've got sniper rifles that one-shot any normal unit on Deathwish. We got the Thanatos that just two-shots dozers on Deathwish. and I'm really concerned about the way that this is going. I think that we're reaching a breaking point. It was already at the point where overkill was a complete joke. Now overkill is just, I don't even like overkill difficulty. You can just pretty much do whatever you want and you'll win at overkill difficulty. So it's going to get to the point where Death Wish is going to be like overkill used to be, where it's sort of the default and Death Wish is easy. And I think we're pretty much at that breaking point once players start to get fed up with how bored they are at overkill and start making the jump to Death Wish. And it's not that I have a problem with people making the jump to Death Wish. It's that I need there to be a difficulty that's actually very, very hard for players like me who are experienced, and there just isn't one. There's nothing, there's no challenge for Payday 2 for me anymore in a group. If I get, me plus 3 even decent players, I'm going to win. Like, it's not even, and it's not because I'm good, it's just because the game's too easy. And I really wish that they would bring back the grueling difficulty. So anyway, thank you guys for listening. Have any questions, post them in the comment here or in the Reddit thread, and I'll do my best to answer them. Until next time, this is Evadebox, aka Sakers the Building Out, and happy heisting.